Stacie Longwell Sadowski is an avid North Manitou backpacker and historian, outdoor writer, and volunteer with the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. In fact, you were promoted this year to Junior Rangers, right? She and her husband, Vince, who is here, are co-owners of 2 Weeks in a Hammock, an education and outreach initiative to inspire regular folks to get out into nature. She is also employed by the Leelanau Conservancy as a major gifts officer. So I'd like to welcome Stacie Sadowski.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I am so pleased that you are here. I didn't know who would show up, how many people would show up. And hello to our at-home audience or people watching this virtually later. We definitely appreciate your attention to the subject and glad that you're interested in North Manitou. Just a quick show of hands in the room. You can do this at home too if you like. Have you been to North Manitou Island? Just curious as to how many folks. Okay, wonderful. We've got a strong showing. It looks like almost half of the people here in the room have been to North Manitou. That's great. Has anyone ever been inside any of the cottages on Cottage Row? Okay, fantastic. I know there's occasionally tour opportunities where you can go and actually see the insides of some of the places. Okay, so without further ado, after a lot of ado, I am Stacie Longwell Sadowski, again, 2weeksinAhammock.com. We've got a lot of resources on our website. On my YouTube channel, I also have a walkthrough video of the Katie Shepherd Hotel, and I'm going to be adding a walkthrough video of one of the other cottages as well in the next week or so. But just wanted to point you to that resource as well as other information and books that are out there and available about North Manitou if you want to research more. Okay, so our topic tonight is North Island, History of Cottage Row. And this is my husband and I, just to tell you a little bit about who I am. I know we've already kind of covered this, so I'll be quick. We are North Manitou fans, campers, backpackers, historians. We met working for Preserve Historic Sleeping Bears volunteers on the Katie Shepherd Hotel project back in 2014. So perks of volunteering, if anyone is interested in being a volunteer, there's a lot of good things that come of it. And we are also, as you can see on the lower right, we are tree huggers. So there's that. So tonight's presentation, just as a quick overview, we're going to talk about the Sleeping Bear Dunes. I know you all are local and familiar with this, but I like to give some context. And context of a brief island history. There are so many things to talk about with North Manitou, but we're really going to focus on the Cottage Row area, which is near the dock and is not in wilderness. We'll talk about the golden age of Cottage Row, the changes that came about to end the golden age, and what happened during the Manitou Island Association years and the National Park Service era and the current efforts to preserve history there. And then we're going to take a walk down Cottage Row virtually. Now, normally I'm giving this I gave this presentation this summer on the island, like physically walking past all the buildings. So this is a little different tonight. And you can see up here, these are pictures of the Katie Shepherd Hotel, which is one of the buildings on Cottage Row on the far southern end. And that's a picture from around the time it was built in the late 1800s. And that's what it looked like in 2009 before restoration efforts started. So of course, you know where the Sleeping Bear Dunes is, just to kind of refresh for those people who may not be here with us tonight. We're in northern Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And the North Manitou Island is one of the 2 islands. There are 72,000 acres in the park all told. There is over 15,000 acres on North Manitou Island. And to get there, you either have to take private boat or you can ride on the public ferry transportation, which is the Mishimokwa with Manitou Island Transit. And that's what it looks like in the upper left when we are getting ready to dock in Fishtown in Leland. And that's what it looks like from the front of the boat when we're sailing over and getting ready to hit the dock on North Manitou. And here's all the campers getting off the boat. Now, there are around 4,000 people who visit as backcountry campers each year on the island. And that's the only real opportunity to stay on the island. Now, I was not a camper when I first went to the island back in 2011, so I had to sneak in with a volunteer group that had housing associated with it. Once I met my husband in 2014 and started backcountry camping, it opened up a whole nother world. And one of the books that's a recommended resource tonight is Rita Hadra-Rusco's book, North Manitou Island, From Sunrise to Sunset. Has anyone in here read that book? Okay, great. We have some people who have. This is part memoir and part island history. I read it before I ever went to the island. So when I went to the island for the first time, I had this magical experience of stepping into a book I'd read, and it was just amazing. And I absolutely fell in love with it and have been a little bit obsessed with island history since. So when we go to the island, the blue arrow on the upper right shows where the dock is. And the dock has got a village area, and all the buildings adjacent to that are not in wilderness. The rest of the island is in federally protected wilderness. And you can see here in this image on the left, there are signs that designate the border into wilderness. And one of our backpacking friends would always kind of touch the sign on the way in, you know, as an entry into this beautiful backcountry. So a little bit about the island history, just to give you some context. Now, these dates are not firm. I kind of roughed it out by decade, just so we could talk about the major movements of history. The Anishinaabe held the land until the treaties of 1836 and 1855 changed that, and it became very much open for European settlers. The logging era, logging happened as early as like the 1830s, mid 1830s, and on in through the 20s, there was a major logging operation over in Crescent on the other side of the island. But logging continued way up until the park took control of it as well. But this was the major logging movement. It happened early on. And what that did was it opened up the opportunity for farming. Some of the folks who came as loggers and some other people who came over as immigrants homesteaded on the island and laid claim to various spots around the island. So there were farmsteads all around the island. There was also maritime history. All of the traffic on the Great Lakes necessitated the need for a life-saving station and also a lighthouse on the southern end, which is no longer there. And the operations for those ended before 1940. Summer Row cottage residents, which we're talking about tonight, came in the mid to early 1880s, and they came from Chicago. It was a pretty easy trip up from Chicago on passenger steamer to come to the island. They could do it within the space of a day and be there and be able to spend a lot of time. It was a pretty easy commute compared to having to travel over land. So it was a very popular thing for folks from Chicago. The Manitou Island Association was a major purchaser of land that came about in the mid 1920s was when they first started. It was a group of financiers from Detroit that were associated with the automotive industry that decided that they also wanted to get in on this recreation. And there was a man named William Angel who came from Continental Motors Company, and he came up and with his other business partners, they started buying up lands. William Angel was the one who introduced deer to the island in the 1920s. So the deer did not swim over. We got that question a lot. My husband and I we did camper orientation as volunteers. So we got that question frequently. But they brought the deer over, and their vision was to have it be a private hunting resort. So you had these kind of conflicting priorities on the island. You had a group of financiers who wanted to buy up all the land. You had farmers who were trying to do their thing. And then you had people who were vacation homeowners that wanted to be left alone. And so they eventually, through the decades, were able to purchase up almost the entire island. So by the time the Park Service completed the purchase of the island and took over in 1984, the Manitou Island Association was the major owner of land on the island. And there was less than 10 private landowners at that time. So the Park Service, of course, our Sleeping Bear Dunes was established in 1970 through an act of Congress, but it took a long time for all those conversations and all of the legal transactions to roll through with the people who had private property within the boundaries of the established park. So the island was one of the later acquisitions in that. And so as you can see here on the top picture, that is the life-saving station complex. Cottage Row sits behind it. As you look at the lower picture, this is a Edward Beebe postcard. He was a famous postcard photographer in the early 1900s. It took a lot of stuff out of North Manitou. You can see the life-saving station buildings in the foreground, and along the background on the ridge, that's Cottage Row. And this would have been the early 1900s. So the Cottage Row plan, it began with Silas Boardman, who was a Chicago retired banker who came to North Manitou in search of health. He was looking for a healthy environment. Chicago at the time was dirty and crowded. And one of the big issues there was water pollution that was a public health hazard. And so a lot of these families wanted to come up to the northern Lake Michigan area to get away from the heat and potential disease in the summer in the city. And he was one of those folks. So he decided he was going to purchase a large tract of land, raise cattle, and have his family have their summer vacation place there. And his daughter, Carrie, was one of the people who was there with him all the time. And Carrie married George Blossom. And one summer, she decided to invite her friends from Chicago, say, hey, why don't y'all come up with us and enjoy North Manitou Island? And so they brought with them the Trudes and the Foots, their other friends from the Hyde Park area in Chicago. And they had such a great time over the summer that by the end of the summer, they said, how can we make this happen every year? Let's come up with a plan. And so the plan was that they worked with Silas Boardman, who was Carrie's father. They bought a tract of land for $500. You would not even touch that today, right? And this plot of land had these 10 lots to it and an 18-acre common area in the front. So this lower picture in the bottom here shows what that common area looks like. It's this big open space, and they were able to build a cottage on their own lot and have this big shared, almost like park-like space that was right in front of the water. So what you see here in the image on the right, where it shows a diagram of the cottages as they stand now, that was on that berm, and everything in front of it was lower. And they could put like a cabana down there, and they could use it as common space. And they also had access to a dock that was on Lake Michigan. And they had access to a docking spot on Lake Manitou, which is a small lake in the center of the island. And so this is a Google map image showing the same thing. The image on the left is showing, kind of further away. And on the right, we've got a close-up spot. And I added numbers, which I did that myself, which is why it looks all crooked. And you've got lots 1 through 10. And the 2 at the top that say U, the northern side, those were unnumbered lots. They were part of the complex. So what they did was oh, that's better, thank you. I just turned the lights down a little bit. So the 10 lots were those 100 by 300 lots. Over on the far side there is the common area. And you can see down in front here, this area, these are the life-saving station buildings down here. So they own this shared space in front of the water. And the first thing that Silas Boardman did was these 2 spots here, he built a lodge here, or he moved it from his farm area. So north of this yet was Silas Boardman's farm operations. And so he moved one of the buildings down to that first spot that says U, and that was used for common lodging and common meals for all the Cottage Row people. These cottages were simple in structure. They didn't have their own kitchens. And so they all came down there to eat. And the second cottage here was when the Blossom family, the Boardmans and the Blossoms, built a cottage there as well. And that's not technically part of Cottage Row, but it's an important part of the history. So let's see. So looking at life on Cottage Row, and this is a picture of the Katie Shepherd Hotel, which is in lot 1 on the southern end. The building began immediately. Once these guys decided they were going to do this, that same year, after the summer residents left and by the time next spring hit, they'd already built that first cottage on that wasn't part of the 10. And that's the Monte Carlo cottage, which we'll talk about more in a minute. The cottages were very simple. They didn't have any electricity, no water, no kitchens. They were not insulated. So they were definitely very summery cottages. Even though this was a resort, it didn't develop a lot of high-end amenities. It was always meant to be somewhat of a rustic, very natural setting. So they had these elegant little cottages, but they were by no means extremely fancy. The families recruited other people from back home in Chicago. So they started telling their friends, hey, we've got this opportunity, you want to buy into it? And so they soon sold all the lots. They had relationships with the local farm families. They bought their food and they bought meat, produce from them. They also employed people from the farms to help manage their houses, help take care of their houses. And Katie Shepherd employed some at her hotel as well. Let's see. And over time, the family, since they spent so much time together at Hyde Park, back at home, and so much time on the island, they began to intermarry. They were very close with one another. They also had the opportunity, some of them took islander, like the year-round farm families, they took some of those kids back to Chicago with them to work in their homes in Chicago, or also to help them finish their schooling in Chicago. So they had a very community-minded relationship with the others. So the changes that happened over time that ended this golden era, just within a few years of starting Cottage Row, Silas Boardman sold out his farming interest. He ran into some financial trouble. And so he sold it to Franklin Newhall and his son Benjamin. And they came in and they took over the farming operation. They still maintained that common eating area on the north end, but eventually they decided they wanted to use that for their logging and farming operations for their staff. So they closed the dining hall. And at that point in time, Katie Shepherd opened up a dining hall at her house. So the Newhalls then eventually, they ran into financial troubles and they ended up selling out their interest to affiliates of the Manitou Island Association and William Angel. But some of the things that impacted Cottage Row was that when North Manitou Island first developed, it was in the middle of everything. There were ships going by all the time, stopping. You know, farmers were able to get a product to market pretty easily. There was an influx of visitors happening a lot. There was the life-saving station and the lighthouse complex were also customers for the local farms. They were able to have this thriving economy. And once things changed, World War I war rationing and also the requisition of passenger ships on Lake Michigan for other purposes, it really slowed down that travel. And also popularity of the automobile impacted how people vacationed and where they went. So they went from being in the middle of everything to being in the middle of nowhere. And that definitely hurts the island's economy, particularly when eventually the lighthouse and the life-saving station closed. And that was around, within that, a few years of that, Katie Shepherd passed away and closed her hotel as well. So things really began to slow down, and a lot of the farmers began to sell out their property to William Angel and the Manitou Island Association, and they began to purchase up the land. So it started to consolidate around this hunting resort group. And their goal was to make a sportsman's resort. One of the things that was a very positive about William Angel was that he was an environmentally minded person, to the point where he didn't want a lot of development on North Manitou. He wanted that land. He loved that space and wanted it to be used and respected well. And so instead of developing it in a way that was harmful to the environment, they were able to do their operations in a little more sensible of a way. And he really cared about the environment out there. They still operated with the large scale farming and logging. And as they purchased cottages, they would rent them out and use them for their resort guests. They also had a lot of guests from the military. This was during the Cold War. This was a very off-grid place to be. They had in the 60s and even into the 70s. They also had a lot of executive guests come out for high-end hunting trips. And if they couldn't shoot a deer, somebody would shoot a deer for them, so they have a deer to take home. There was also apparently a lot of drinking that went on from what I've read. So the cottages, so this sign over here, it says, please no cleaning fish in the cottage. This picture was taken in the Monte Carlo cottage probably about 8 or 9 years ago. Since then, eventually when the kitchens closed at the Katie Shepherd, the people who still own cottages built kitchens on the back of their cottages and bathrooms. So they ended up having indoor plumbing and kitchens in some of them. And they've now, since the park is working on restoring those buildings. And so the additions that were the kitchens have now been removed from most of those cottages. And when Sleeping Bear established in 1970, it was determined that houses that were built after December 31st, 1964 had to be removed from the park. That was the cutoff date for that. So that's why we see many of the older homes still there on North Manitou. So walking down Cottage Row. So for those of you who've been there, this is always a site that I was just, oh, there it is. So there was, in front of all these cottages was a boardwalk, and it had gas lamps along the boardwalk. And so you can kind of imagine these women in the long flowing dresses and the lit gas lights. They had one of the boys who was a son of one of the local farm families came, and he would light the lights at night. And you can still see today when you walk along there, on the picture on the right, the rocks were the base of the boardwalk. So they're still there. And this is one of the main paths heading south on the island. Campers like to walk past all the cottages. And it's also become a bit of a two-track, as you can see, for the maintenance folks. This particular area, as I said before, is not in wilderness, so they can drive there. And here's some other pictures of what it looks like along the boardwalk. In the upper left, this is in front of the Katie Shepherd Hotel, which actually had, since it was at the very end, had a poured cement sidewalk in front of it. So you can see that in that picture. And down here on the right in the center, that is Katie Shepherd herself of Chicago and North Manitou. And of course, the color pictures are more recent. I took those, and they're looking out onto the Manitou Passage, and you can get a feel for what that would have looked like standing out there as a summer guest. And this particular picture of Katie Shepherd, you can see that she's standing next to a well gazebo. The ruins of it are still there. Right off the bluff, they had some steps down to a well pump, and several of the cottages had those along there as well. So looking at the actual cottages, this is lot number 1, which is on the far south end of the strip. And it was the Katie Shepherd Hotel. The top picture is what it looked like originally, and the bottom picture is what it looked like when the group, the volunteer group, finished the restoration efforts back in 2019. And so it was built in 1985. It was built by, or 1895, I always get that wrong. Built 1895 by the Shepherd family of Chicago. And they built it with the intention that their daughter Katie might be able to do a commercial operation there someday. Katie was quite an entrepreneur for her day. Her father was a fire insurance salesman who moved to Chicago from Louisiana after the Great Chicago Fire. And he had one of his first jobs when he came to Chicago was he had to guard a barrel of nails in a warehouse because everyone was rebuilding, and it was Chicago. And so he was physically guarding these nails. Eventually he moved his family to Chicago, and his daughter Katie became an insurance agent. And she was not a clerk in the back room. She was an actual agent, which was unheard of for a woman to be a business person in that day. So she was quite a trailblazer in that respect. So in 1908, she opened the hotel she opened it as the Beaches Hotel, did a little remodeling, put some more partitions upstairs. There's 9 rooms in this house. She ran it for decades, and behind the house was a dining hall. And so that's where they had, since they were from Louisiana, it was that Southern style of having a separate kitchen out back, and they had that in the dining hall. And guests would line up around this porch and wait for the second seating. It was a hub of activity. This was where everybody came for food and for fun and to hang out. She closed it in 1932 due to her failing health. She passed away a few years after that at the age of 69, so she died relatively young. Her family rented it briefly to a family friend, and then it remained shuttered until 2009, until the restoration efforts started to happen with it. And this is what it looks like on the inside. It's like breathtakingly beautiful. And if you go on my website, there's a link to the YouTube channel where I did a walkthrough the last year we worked on it as volunteers. It has got beautiful wood interior. All of these cottages have beautiful wood interiors to them. There's no plaster or anything like that. They all, and they're thin because they're summer cottages, so they wouldn't be very warm in the winter. And that's Eleanor and William Shepard, her parents. Then in lot number 2 is the Hewitt cottage. The Hewitts were from, and this is not actually the Hewitt cottage, this was their daughter's treehouse. So the Hewitt cottage was this beautiful little shingle style cottage next door. The couple was from England, and it was said that their cottage was beautifully decorated inside. And she had some really nice gardens too. Later, they sold it to the Rhodes family, who built a treehouse for their daughter, Margaret. And this is the treehouse. But when Margaret got married, they built in the bottom of the treehouse. So that's why it looks like a 2-story treehouse. It's not really. And what you can see, there used to be large trees on both ends that are now just stumps and gone. But so it kind of sat between the trees. And I love this picture because it shows North Manitou in the winter. Like, one of my big dreams in a weird way is to be out there in the winter and to see what it was really like. Because some of the memoir I've read were amazing to think about being out there. The actual cottage fell apart and was removed by the Manitou Island Association in the 40s. And this is, it's got, the park keeps really good roofs on all these buildings, so they stay protected. And many of them are in active restoration right now. You know, it's kind of a slow turning wheel, but this is the inside of it. And I've never been inside this cottage. This is me holding my camera, taking a picture through the window. But what's interesting about this is that you can see this wall behind the fireplace has got like split logs that still have their bark on them, which is an interesting choice for right next to the fireplace, to say the least. And then this other picture is on the right is detail of the shutters. Like, one end of it has kind of got like real wooden working shutters that the slats open and close on it, that made it kind of a enclosed porch in a way. And lot number 3 is the Blossom Cottage. This was moved. This was where Carrie and George lived. They moved this house down from the farm area. And even when the park first took this over in the 80s, this building was already too far gone. And it currently is a pile of, it's currently a pile of debris with a couple chimneys there, which is when we look at the Katie Shepherd Hotel and that it was able to be saved, this is the example of what happens when you can't save something when it's too far gone. But this picture has some interesting detail in it, that you can see the stairs that came down that bluff to the lower park area. The next house down is lot number 4, the Trude Cottage. And the picture at the top is detail from that opening photograph. And then below you can see that's what it looks like. That's what it looked like. This is maybe a 2 or 3 year old picture. The Park Service has gone through just in the last year or two and redone all the foundations of these cottages, which is great because the roofs and the foundations are kept in good shape. And so they'll be able to, you know, move on and continue with restoration work. This was the Trudes were some of the original Chicago Friends. This was built in 1894 by Nicholas Phelan of Chicago. He was a Chicago builder that was recruited, he and his brother, to come to North Manitou to do this cottage and the next one. And they fell in love with the place and never left. They lived there until they both passed away of old age. And they homesteaded down on the southern part of the island. And then in their later years, they lived like half a mile down from Cottage Row in a house that was near the beach as well. So he built this cottage and several others in a dog trot style, which is a southern style of architecture, which has got like one central room to catch the breeze and a couple rooms on the sides. So again, a very simple structure. You can see that in this picture in the bottom, the house is a little bit longer than in the top. They added on additional rooms, and there's an additional bathroom that was added later. And this also has a couple of other small outbuildings behind it as well. And this house was owned by the Fisk family, Clark Fisk in particular, until it was purchased directly by the national park. So the Fisk family never sold it to the Manitou Island Association. And this is what the inside looks like. Again, it's got this beautiful wood interior and this really interesting wallpaper in the bathroom, which everybody likes. And I did, when I was out volunteering this summer, I did a walkthrough video inside this because the group I was with was also working on this cottage. And so I'll be putting that up in the next few days on my YouTube channel so you can see what it looks like to walk through and around the outside of this cottage. And these cottages all had the fireplaces to kind of drive off a chill on a chilly summer up north day. Next one, lot number 5 is Howard Foote Cottage. Howard and Josephine Foote were some of the original Chicago friends as well. And Nicholas Phelan built this house for them. It is also dog trot style, but the porch does not go all the way across the front. It's more centrally located. Notice in the bottom picture, the porch has steps going off the front, and in the top, they now go off the sides. So at some point that was, the porch was changed. It was later sold to S.W. McMunn, who was the father of Mary Bernique. And if you're familiar with the island, there is the Bernique place on the southern end of the island, which was a farm that was a hobby farm for the Bernique family. They were from Chicago also. They were friends with these other folks, but they lived a little differently. Instead of living this kind of glamping lifestyle with the other cottagers, they lived on a hobby farm that they ran, and they had hired people that lived there year round and cared for it. And they would go back to Chicago in the winters. They ran dance studios in Chicago, ballroom dancing. But so Mary Bernique, her father owned this house for a while. And later it was owned by William Stark of Stark Brothers Nursery. And Stark Brothers Nursery was responsible for some of the apple trees that are out on North now. And later was sold to William Angel of the Manitou Island Association in 1928. It was one of the earlier properties that he scooped up as he came along. And this is as much as I love the Katie Shepherd Hotel, this is my favorite cottage. On the inside, you can see it's got these very high vaulted ceilings, and it's just spectacular to be inside it. You can see the detail on the right. If you look closely, there's like thin beadwork in the wood. It's got some really, and all these cottages are beautiful woodwork like this on the inside. And they just, when you see them, you're like, yes, we want to save these. These are amazing. The black square with the right handle. They're, oh, over here? Yeah, I'm not sure what it is. There's some, I'm not sure over here. I'm not sure what that is actually. It looks like a metal, some kind of a metal structure. Okay, great. So maybe it was an oil stove. I haven't been in this cottage in a couple of years, so I'm not sure. Going down the line, the next 2 lots are currently vacant. One had the Keating Cottage on it, which was similar to the, it was built by Phelan. It was similar to the last cottage as well, but it got moved down a ways to the north end beyond where the lodge used to be, and the foundation wasn't really good. So that building actually ended up getting to be in bad shape and falling down. So that's no longer there. But you can see in this picture on the lower left, that's the cottage we just looked at. And then there's a couple blank spaces. What's really exciting is the roses. Just in the last couple of years, one of the volunteers out there, who is a former interpretive ranger, Dave Hooper, started identifying and marking old roses. And once he started marking them, and the maintenance crews would not mow over them, they grew back. These roses are probably easily 100 years old. And so there's several of them now that have these little trellises. So that was like going this summer and seeing the roses were in full bloom was just a delight. That was my most exciting discovery this summer. We always see something new. And there's several others in other places around Cottage Row as well that are marked like this. So, oh, and then let's see, lot 7 is vacant, never built on. Okay, lot 8, the Riggs Cottage. This is one of them where, this is such a cute cottage. It was built in 1924. It was also built by Nicholas Phelan, but it'd been a couple decades, so he kind of switched it up a little. This is obviously different from the other cottages he had done. It's got these interesting like eyebrow features over the front door and the front windows. And in the lower 2 pictures, this lower left side, that's what it looks like from the back. The windows have been reglazed on this cottage, so they look really nice. And on the bottom, you can see that the results of the effort of redoing the foundation and then redoing the skirting around it as well. So that's one that's been redone. But in the few years between these 2 pictures, you can see that the steps on the front doorway have like crumbled. So that was like cement, and it kind of fell apart because of the weathering. The next one, lot number 9, is the Shirley Foote Alford Cottage. So this was built in 1901 by Howard Foote. Howard Foote was the one who built the cottage that I said was my favorite with the vaulted ceiling. And he decided in 1901 he wanted to do a bigger cottage down the way. So this was the second cottage he built, and he sold that first one. And that's in the upper right. And it was destroyed by fire in 1934. They had like a wedding on the island. There was a party, and there was a chimney fire right afterwards that burnt the building down. There was no loss of life, but it was a total loss of the building and the contents. So they had to rebuild. And at that point, his daughter, Shirley, owned it, and she replaced it with a Sears kit home, which is what you see in the lower right. And it was a really, because of the timing, you know, this was the Great Depression, things were slowing down on the island, and it didn't make sense to rebuild a large building that needed a lot of care and was expensive. So they went with something simpler that was easy to construct on a remote island. And so that's the Sears home. And this picture is from a couple years ago. And now since then, this is the only privately owned cottage on the island. The Foote Alford family were able to maintain ownership of they had the opportunity, they qualified for and opted to maintain private ownership of their cottage. So they were very fortunate, and they still go out every year and they still enjoy their cottage. And they've done, this was a few years ago. So if you go to the island now, they've like added some like wood shingling to the front wall there, the front facade. But I love this picture as I was going through my old photos, because they've got their like little furniture set out front, which just makes it adorable and inviting. The small building in the back in this picture was a cherry picker migrant worker hut that is now sitting on this property that they own still, but that would have been relocated from another spot. And I've never been inside that cottage. The next one, okay, so now that was lot 10, or that was lot 9, sorry. Lot 10 is vacant. And lot 10 was always vacant, and William Angel grew alfalfa, so he would attract the deer to come into Cottage Row so he could see them more often. And now we're into the bonus area. This was a 3-acre plot north of Cottage Row that was established by Boardman at the beginning to have his family owned cottage here, as well as the lodge, which sat next door. The lodge is no longer there. It burned down in 1953, but this cottage was, it's called the Monte Carlo because in later years it got a reputation for being kind of a party house with the visiting college boys and local farm hands would play cards and hang out. So but that wasn't the Boardman family. That was all the local young guys hanging out. It was built in 1893 and 94, and it's a suspected Frank Lloyd Wright design. It has not been proven conclusively, but there's some circumstantial evidence. Frank Lloyd Wright designed a home for George and Carrie Blossom in Chicago. And there was an advertisement that was found where Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to hire workers to come to an island in Lake Michigan. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence around it, as well as you'll notice the architectural style of this cottage is much different from all the other ones we saw. It has got this long, low roof line. You can see the front door is wide. It's much wider than the other ones. And everything about it's got that long, low, wide design style that's indicative of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie style. It also originally did not have rooms on the sides. You can see here how in this lower picture, there's built-on rooms on the sides of the cottage. It originally had a very wide wraparound porch that was the same width on the sides as it is on the front. And the family later then built those additional rooms on it. I've read about Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is my personal theory, because I know he's like super picky about the way people lived in his houses, that he might have disowned this structure after they changed it. But one historian I talked to who did a lot of research into this said that his working theory was that Frank Lloyd Wright might have like did a back of the napkin design for him and said, oh, you should do a cottage like this, but he might not have been the one to implement it. But it certainly seems to have some influence from him. So that is inconclusive, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Society, or whatever that organization is, does not claim this as an official Frank Lloyd Wright structure. And this last year, so for the picture I took at the top was taken maybe almost 10 years ago. The jack posts have been on the corner of this building for a long time because the park knew they wanted to protect it because it was starting to sag, but it took a long time to get around to doing it. So it kind of shows some of the preventative measures the park takes to make sure they're doing things right while they're waiting to make all their decisions. And just this last year, after they did the foundations, they did this really beautiful porch surface on here as well. And there'll be more efforts continuing because in the top, you can see they took off the walls around the porch. That wasn't original. And that's some of the views on the inside. It's also got a large fireplace as well. And this was the cottage that William Angel liked to stay in himself when he came to the island. And of course, the bathroom wasn't original. That was an add-on. And like several of the other cottages, they recently have taken the late additions off the backs of them. The next one down was the lodge and dining hall that was moved there by Boardman. And it was always intended from the start to be used as dining. And it was used that way up until around 1908-ish, 1907, 1908, when Newhall then decided he wanted to use it for other purposes. So he closed it. And that's when Katie Shepard took up that opportunity to open up the hotel dining down on her end. And the structure was destroyed by fire in 1953. So if you come to the island now, you kind of can see a low spot where it used to sit. And this picture is some of the workers on North Manitou Cottage Row. So a little more about Katie Shepard. In this picture, she's standing in the center with her father, William. As I mentioned, she was an entrepreneur and a businesswoman, an insurance agent and hotelier. She was community-minded, and she's an admired and happy person. She never had any children. And I recently was contacted through Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear by her great nephew. And he was doing his ancestry research on ancestry.com. And like most people, going straight up the family tree and researching all his ancestors. And then eventually he started researching greats, aunts, and uncles. And then, oh, he had an Aunt Katie Shepard. And then when he did more research into her, he found out she owned a house in a national park. And he was delighted because he had then seen that preservation work was happening there. And so he reached out, and we've had several phone conversations, and he and his Aunt Pam contributed some of the images I'm showing tonight. But he said that she was just a wonderful person and was definitely well loved. And so after Katie Shepard passed away, the hotel was inherited by her niece Edna. And this is a picture of Edna standing in front of Cottage Row. And I just love this picture for obvious reasons. She's happy and carefree. This is what you look like when you go to North Manitou Island. You're happy and smiling. She eventually sold the hotel to, she grew up coming there regularly, and she had a great love for the island and a great love for the house that her family had owned, but she couldn't maintain it and eventually decided that she needed to sell it. And it ended up being purchased eventually by affiliates of the Manitou Island Association, who did not do much with it, and they shuttered it. They didn't have it rented out like a lot of the other cottages. It was a bit closed and off limits most of those years. There was some use of it, but it didn't get the heavy use that the other buildings did. And then these are my favorite two pictures. This is the Katie Shepherd Hotel from the southern ends. This is what it looked like back in 2009 before restoration. The house was not far away from collapsing internally. It had a 5-inch sag on the interior, on the upper floor. It had to be completely structurally buttressed on the inside before work could be done. The porch was falling through. It was a home for raccoons and bats and mice. And so it had to be completely redone. And then that's what it looked like when the work was completed. So just kind of to show you, this is what, when we look at an eye on the future, the dream for these cottages would be to see them restored. And although a lot of them, look like they need paint right now, they are certainly being cared for structurally, with the foundations being redone and the roofs being cared for. So eventually we should be seeing even more good things come out of North Manitou. And so I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from Rita Hedra-Rusko's book: "Those claimed by the spirit of the Manitou will always yearn to return." So if you've been there, you'll probably want to go back. And I'd like to thank you so much for having me. I want to give a big thank you to the Benzie Area Historical Society for inviting me to come out and speak. Also, a big thank you to the folks who shared images for use in this presentation with me. It was Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, the Leelanau Historical Society, the Rita Hedra-Rusko family, the Katie Shepherd family, Pat Truong and Rob Funderburg, and volunteer Ron Poritz. So, thank you.